I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, not emotionally, not defensively, not because you hate someone or like someone. Just honestly. When you look back at the way Timmy was treated by Patrick, do you think it was love, or do you think it was opportunity? Because that question changes everything. People keep wanting this to be simple. Good guy, bad guy. Savior, villain. But this situation sits in a much more uncomfortable space, especially when the person in the middle is someone like Timmy. Someone who doesn't have the tools to understand motives, money, contracts, or content. Someone whose trust comes easily because kindness feels rare. And that's why this matters. Timmy didn't need someone extraordinary to love him. He needed someone basic. Someone who didn't scare him. Someone who talked to him. Someone who let him feel included. That bar is low, and that's exactly why this situation is so dangerous. Because when the bar is low, it's easy for someone to step over it and look like a hero. Let's talk about what we actually saw. Timmy laughing. Timmy smiling. Timmy following Patrick around. Timmy enjoying the dog, the house, the attention. None of that is fake. Timmy's reactions were real. His attachment was real. His trust was real. But the real question isn't whether Timmy cared about Patrick. The question is whether Patrick ever saw Timmy as a person first, or as a product first. That's where everything shifts. Because you can be nice to someone and still exploit them. Those two things are not opposites. They can coexist. And that's the part people struggle to accept. Exploitation doesn't always look cruel. Sometimes it looks friendly. Sometimes it looks playful. Sometimes it looks like joking around, sharing food, letting someone feel special. That's how trust is built. And once trust is built, boundaries blur. Think about how the content started. Casual, light-hearted, almost wholesome. Look at this guy. Isn't he funny? Isn't this sweet? That's how audiences were pulled in. That's how sympathy turned into views, and views turned into money. Now ask yourself this. At what point did Timmy consent to being monetized? Not implied consent. Not, he seemed happy. Actual consent. Informed consent. The kind that requires understanding what's happening, why it's happening, and what the consequences are. That consent never existed. And before anyone says, well, that's just how content works, stop. Because content involving vulnerable adults is not the same as content involving influencers who understand the system. Timmy wasn't playing the game. He didn't know there was a game. He didn't know people were paying to watch him. He didn't know people were buying access to him. He didn't know his presence had a dollar amount attached to it. And that's the core issue. People keep arguing about whether Patrick liked Timmy. That's not the standard. Liking someone doesn't give you the right to profit from them. Caring about someone doesn't cancel out exploitation. If you're the one controlling the money, the platform, and the narrative. There's also something else that needs to be said plainly. Timmy's affection was predictable. You treat him kindly, he attaches. You give him attention, he responds. That's not manipulation on Timmy's part. That's vulnerability. And anyone who understands that dynamic understands the responsibility that comes with it. So when people say, but Timmy loved him, that doesn't defend Patrick. It actually makes the situation worse. Because if Timmy trusted him, then Patrick had a higher duty of care, not a lower one. And here's where things get uncomfortable. There are messages, alleged messages, conversations that suggest money was always part of the plan, that the idea of Timmy as content wasn't accidental, that it wasn't just something that happened along the way. Whether those messages ever become fully verified or not, the pattern around them matters. paid FaceTimes, monetized interactions, subscriptions, requests, scaling the content, expanding the audience. None of that happens by accident. That takes intention. And once intention enters the picture, we have to stop pretending this was just friendship, because friendship doesn't require paywalls. Friendship doesn't involve selling access. Friendship doesn't involve contracts, percentages, or negotiations behind the scenes. Now, let's talk about something people avoid because it complicates their narrative. Did Patrick ever show real affection toward Timmy? Possibly. Did Patrick ever enjoy Timmy's company? Maybe. Did Patrick ever feel something genuine? That's entirely possible. But sincerity does not erase exploitation. People are not either saints or monsters. They are often both caring and self-serving at the same time. And that's what makes this so difficult to accept. You can like someone and still use them. You can feel affection and still cross ethical lines. And when the person being used doesn't understand what's happening, that crosses into something much darker. This is where the word trusted becomes heavy. Timmy trusted Patrick. Timmy followed him. Timmy felt safe enough to be himself. That trust was not neutral. It had weight. It created responsibility. And that responsibility was not handled properly. Because if it had been, there would have been safeguards. Independent oversight, clear financial structures, transparent compensation, someone whose only job was to protect Timmy's interests. None of that existed. Instead, everything flowed through the same hands. Content creation, money, access, narrative. That's not protection. That's control. And control, even when wrapped in kindness, is still control. So when people ask whether Patrick deserves to be locked up, they're asking the wrong question. The real question is whether Timmy was protected, and by every reasonable ethical standard, he wasn't. Because protection would have meant removing money from the equation entirely, or putting it somewhere Timmy actually benefited from, directly and safely. Protection would have meant no paid access. Protection would have meant no monetization without legal guardianship oversight. Protection would have meant recognizing that Timmy's sweetness made him vulnerable, not marketable. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. People want to believe that because Timmy smiled, nothing wrong happened. But exploitation doesn't require visible suffering. It requires imbalance, power, control, lack of understanding. And that imbalance was always there. Timmy didn't choose the camera. Timmy didn't choose the platform. Timmy didn't choose the monetization. Those choices were made around him, not with him. And that's why this story isn't about whether Patrick ever laughed with Timmy, or fed him, or joked with him. It's about whether someone who understood the system took advantage of someone who didn't. And the answer to that question doesn't depend on emotions. It depends on structure. Who controlled the money? Who controlled the access? Who controlled the story? And who had no control at all? That's where accountability lives. Before we move on to the next part, I want you to answer this in the comments, honestly. Do you think Timmy was ever seen as a person first? Or was he always a means to an end? And don't answer based on how you feel about Patrick. Answer based on what Timmy deserved. Because that's the only perspective that actually matters. There's something people don't want to sit with because it forces them to slow down and think instead of react. Exploitation doesn't usually begin with bad intentions. It begins with permission that was never meant to be given. When Patrick first entered Timmy's life, It didn't look like a crime. It looked like access. It looked like inclusion. It looked like someone finally taking interest. And that's how lines start to blur, not just for the person being used, but for everyone watching it happen in real time. Because once an audience decides someone is good for them, scrutiny softens. People stop asking questions. They stop demanding structure. They stop noticing that no one is advocating solely for the vulnerable person's interests. They assume that affection equals protection, and that assumption is where damage quietly grows. Let's talk about Timmy's role in all of this, because it was never passive, not in the way people think. Timmy was participating. He was talking, laughing, playing, showing up, giving reactions that people responded to emotionally. But participation is not consent when the participant doesn't understand the stakes. Participation is not consent when the participant doesn't know their presence is being monetized. And that's the part that gets overlooked again and again. Timmy didn't know he was performing. He didn't know people were paying. He didn't know his likeness, his behavior, his voice, his time were being converted into income. He was just being Timmy. Now ask yourself this. If Timmy had known there was money involved, if he had known people were buying access to him, would he have understood what that meant? Would he have known how to say yes or no in a meaningful way? The answer is obvious, and it's uncomfortable, which is why the responsibility was never supposed to be his. It belonged entirely to the adults around him. And that's where this story turns. Because Patrick wasn't just a friend hanging out. He became a gatekeeper, a middleman, someone who controlled when Timmy appeared, how he appeared, and how the audience interacted with him. That power imbalance matters. It's not small. It's not semantic. When one person controls access to another human being and profits from it, safeguards are not optional. They are mandatory. And there were none. No neutral third party overseeing money. No clear accounting showing how much Timmy generated versus how much he received. No legal guardian independent of the content creation. No separation between help and income. Everything flowed through one channel. That's not an accident. And this is where people start to defend what happened by pointing to outcomes. But Timmy had fun. But he got to go places. But he had food. But he smiled. Let's be clear about something uncomfortable. Basic kindness is not payment. Giving someone attention is not compensation. Letting someone exist in your space does not entitle you to profit from their presence. If Timmy was working, and yes, appearing in monetized content is work, then he deserved protections, representation, and fair compensation placed somewhere he could actually benefit from. That didn't happen, and the reason it didn't happen matters. Because setting that up would have slowed things down. It would have introduced oversight. It would have limited how freely the money could move. Oversight is the enemy of exploitation. That's not an insult. That's a fact. Now, let's talk about intent versus outcome. Because people confuse these two constantly. Someone can start with curiosity and end with greed. Someone can begin with affection and gradually rationalize exploitation. Someone can convince themselves they deserve the money because they're doing the work, because they're around all the time, because they're the one dealing with it. Those justifications are incredibly common in exploitation cases. I'm the one helping. I'm the one there. I'm the one who cares. And slowly, the vulnerable person becomes secondary to the narrative of the helper. That's when things flip. Timmy stopped being a person to protect and became a reason to justify behavior. And that's when accountability disappears. Let's also address something people tiptoe around. Patrick wasn't operating in a vacuum. There was an audience encouraging this. There were viewers praising him. There were comments reinforcing the idea that he was doing something noble. That social reinforcement matters because it creates a feedback loop. The more praise someone receives for helping, the less likely they are to question their own behavior. Criticism starts to feel like an attack. Skepticism feels like hate. And when skepticism is framed as cruelty, exploitation thrives. That's how boundaries get erased. Now, think about Timmy's dependency. Timmy didn't have the ability to walk away from the situation on his own terms. He didn't control transportation. He didn't control communication. He didn't control finances. He didn't control housing. He didn't control access to the outside world. When someone like that bonds with you, you hold enormous power over their emotional and practical reality. That power demands restraint. It demands humility. It demands that you constantly ask, is this for them? Or is this for me? And nothing about the monetization model suggests that question was being asked seriously. Instead, we saw escalation. More content. More access. More money. More blending of help and profit. That's not stability. That's momentum. And momentum doesn't care who gets hurt as long as it keeps moving. There's also something else people avoid because it complicates the story even further. Timmy loving Patrick doesn't mean Patrick loved Timmy in a healthy way. Love without boundaries can be harmful. Love that benefits one side financially is not neutral. Love that requires secrecy, contracts, or control is not safe love. And this isn't about demonizing affection. It's about recognizing that affection doesn't excuse harm. If anything, it increases responsibility, because hurting someone who trusts you is worse than hurting someone who doesn't. That's why this story hits so hard. Because Timmy didn't see danger. He saw a friend, and that friend was in a position to protect him from being used. Instead, Timmy became the reason the system existed at all. Now, think about the long-term consequences. Timmy is no longer with the people he grew up with. He's no longer in familiar surroundings. His life has been altered permanently. And no matter how you feel about the condition of the home or the state intervention, you cannot ignore that exploitation helped create the chaos that led to separation. The internet didn't save Timmy. It destabilized him. Because when vulnerable lives become content, systems eventually intervene. And when they do, they don't ask the internet's permission. They remove people. They impose silence. They shut doors. And the people left behind are the ones who pay the emotional price. Timmy didn't get to vote on any of that. So when people ask, was Patrick always in it for the money? They're really asking something else. They're asking whether Timmy was ever the priority. And based on what we can see, the answer is painfully unclear. Because if Timmy had been the priority, the structure would have looked completely different. It would have been boring. It would have been slow. It would have been transparent. And boring doesn't go viral. That's the hardest truth. Ethical care rarely makes money. And money-driven care rarely stays ethical. So, Before we move to the next part, I want you to think about this and answer it honestly in the comments. At what point does help become control? And once that line is crossed, do intentions even matter anymore? There's another layer to this that people avoid because it forces them to confront something uncomfortable about themselves. Not just Patrick, not just Eric, not just the system, but the audience. Because exploitation doesn't survive on one person alone. It survives on permission, silent permission, emotional permission, financial permission. And Timmy's situation is the clearest example of how that permission was granted again and again without anyone stopping to ask who actually had the right to say yes. Let's talk about money without dancing around it. When people donated, subscribed, paid for content, or engaged with monetized posts, most of them believed they were helping Timmy directly. They believed the money was for food, care, safety, stability, maybe even a future. That belief didn't come out of nowhere. It was cultivated. Language matters here. Helping, taking care of, looking out for, doing what the family can't. Those phrases carry emotional weight, and when they're repeated enough, they stop being questioned. They become assumptions. And assumptions are dangerous when vulnerable people are involved, because at no point did donors have a clear, enforceable guarantee that Timmy benefited financially in any meaningful way. No trust, no guardian-controlled account, no transparent breakdown of income versus expenses, no legal framework separating caregiving from profit. Everything flowed through adults who were also benefiting from the exposure. That's not charity. That's dependency with a price tag. And dependency is exactly what makes exploitation possible. Timmy depended on others for nearly everything. Transportation, housing, communication, understanding the world around him. When someone in that position becomes the center of monetized attention, the burden of protection shifts entirely to the adults managing that attention. That protection failed. Now, let's address something people keep misusing as a defense. But Timmy was happy. Happiness does not equal safety. Children can be happy in abusive homes. Adults with intellectual disabilities can be happy while being exploited. Happiness only tells you how someone feels in a moment, not whether their rights are being protected. Timmy laughing on camera doesn't mean he understood the transaction happening around him. It doesn't mean he agreed to it. It doesn't mean he was being treated fairly. It only means he was being himself. And that's exactly why the responsibility was so high. When someone can't advocate for themselves financially, legally, or structurally, the adults around them are required to do it without personal gain. The moment personal gain enters the equation, everything changes. Motives blur, decisions shift, boundaries erode. Let's also talk about normalization, because this is where exploitation becomes invisible. At first, content featuring Timmy felt novel. People watched out of curiosity. Then it felt heartwarming. Then it felt familiar. Then it felt routine. And once something becomes routine, people stop examining it. The audience began to see Timmy as part of the channel. That framing alone is a problem. No vulnerable person should ever be part of the brand. The moment someone's identity becomes content, the incentive is no longer their well-being. It's engagement. And engagement thrives on consistency. Consistency requires access. Access requires control. Control requires power. That's the chain. And Timmy was at the bottom of it. Now, let's look at how affection gets weaponized, because this is subtle and deeply manipulative, even when it's not consciously planned. Timmy formed an emotional bond. That bond was real. You can see it in how he interacted, how he responded, how he trusted. That trust made him easier to film, easier to feature, easier to include. But it also made it harder for anyone to intervene without looking like the villain. Anyone who questioned the situation could be framed as trying to take something away from Timmy. Anyone who raised concerns could be accused of jealousy, negativity, or cruelty. That's how emotional shielding works. The vulnerable person's feelings are used as armor to protect the system exploiting them. And it works incredibly well, because no one wants to be the person who ruins something that looks happy on the surface. But protecting someone isn't about preserving appearances. It's about preserving dignity, autonomy, and future stability. Timmy's future stability was never prioritized. If it had been, the structure would have included a neutral guardian overseeing all finances, limits on how often and how Timmy appeared on camera, clear boundaries between caregiving and income, documentation of consent and understanding, long-term planning beyond views and donations. None of that was visible. Instead, what we saw was improvisation. And improvisation is not protection. Now let's talk about escalation, because exploitation rarely starts extreme. It escalates. More content leads to more income. More income creates pressure to maintain access. Pressure encourages rationalization. Rationalization erodes ethics. Ethics collapse quietly, not explosively. People don't wake up one day and say, "I'm going to exploit someone." They wake up saying, "I deserve this. I've put in the work. I'm the one dealing with the hard parts. They'd be worse off without me." Those thoughts are dangerous because they turn help into entitlement, and entitlement is the enemy of accountability. At some point, Timmy stopped being seen as a person whose rights needed safeguarding and became a justification for decisions already made. That's not care. That's ownership behavior. And ownership behavior toward a human being is always wrong, no matter how much affection is attached to it. Now consider the outcome. Timmy is no longer living with his family. He is no longer visible. He no longer has access to people who recognized him outside of content. Whatever your opinion is about the house, the conditions, or the state's role, one thing is undeniable. Timmy lost agency over his own story. And that loss didn't begin with the state. It began the moment he was turned into monetized content without safeguards. That's the part people keep skipping. The system didn't step in randomly. Systems intervene when situations become unstable, unregulated, and risky. Monetization without structure creates instability. Exposure without protection creates risk. And risk eventually triggers intervention. So when people say, "The state ruined everything," they're ignoring the chain of events that made intervention inevitable. Timmy wasn't protected from exploitation early, so the protection came later, harsher, and with more loss. That's how these stories end. Not with justice, with separation, with silence, with consequences no one wanted, but everyone helped create. And this is where the audience has to look in the mirror. Watching isn't neutral. Donating isn't neutral. Sharing isn't neutral. Every interaction reinforced a system that centered money before safeguards. That doesn't make viewers villains, but it does make them participants. and participation carries responsibility. So here's the question I want you to sit with before part 4. If Timmy had never gone viral, would he still have lost his family, his home, and his voice? Or did the attention that claimed to help him actually make everything worse? Answer that honestly, because that answer changes how we talk about responsibility. There's a point in every story like this where the conversation has to shift away from personalities and toward patterns. Because if this only stays about Patrick or Eric or even Timmy, then the real lesson gets lost. And the real lesson is much bigger than one family. The Whittaker situation didn't collapse because one person was bad. It collapsed because multiple failures lined up at the same time, and no one stepped in early enough to slow it down. This is where intent stops mattering as much as impact. You can believe Patrick cared. You can believe Eric believed he was helping. You can believe donors had good hearts. You can believe viewers were just watching. And still, the outcome can be harm. That's the part people struggle with. Because we want harm to come from villains, not from people who smile on camera, pet dogs, buy groceries, and say the right words. But real-world exploitation rarely looks like a movie villain. It looks like blurred lines, unchecked power, and emotional storytelling that outruns ethics. Let's talk about power for a moment. Power isn't just physical strength or money. Power is control over access, control over information. So instead of resistance, you get compliance. And compliance gets mistaken for consent. Now, let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough. Escalation pressure. Once money starts flowing, it doesn't stay still. Expectations rise. Audiences want more. Platforms reward frequency. Algorithms punish silence. That creates a cycle where the vulnerable person must remain visible to sustain income. And visibility becomes obligation. Timmy didn't just appear on camera. He became a reason for content to exist. And once someone becomes a reason, removing them feels like loss. Loss of views, loss of income, loss of relevance. That's when exploitation becomes normalized. Not because anyone says, "I'm exploiting him," but because the system quietly demands his continued presence. And here's the most uncomfortable truth of all. The state didn't intervene because Timmy was happy or unhappy. They intervened because the environment around him became legally and ethically indefensible. Monetized exposure, unclear financial benefit, unregulated caregiving, conflict between helpers, escalating accusations, public scrutiny. Those are red flags to authorities. So when people say the system destroyed the family, they're skipping the reality that the system steps in when private systems fail. This doesn't mean the outcome is perfect. It doesn't mean it's humane. It doesn't mean it's emotionally just. It means it's reactive. And reactive systems are blunt instruments. They don't preserve nuance. They don't preserve bonds. They don't preserve routines. They preserve liability reduction. That's why the result feels so cruel. Because Timmy didn't just lose access to exploitation. He lost access to everything familiar. And that's the tragedy. If proper protections had been in place from the beginning, state intervention might never have been necessary. Timmy could have remained with his family, with support, without becoming content. But that window closed. Now, let's talk about accountability without turning it into vengeance. Patrick's arrest doesn't fix Timmy's loss. Eric being charged wouldn't undo the separation. Viewers feeling guilty won't restore the family unit. Accountability here is about learning, not punishing for sport. And the lesson is painfully clear. Vulnerable people cannot be the foundation of income streams without independent oversight. Caregiving cannot coexist with profit without strict boundaries. And attention is not help unless it is paired with protection. If you strip away the names, the story becomes universal. A vulnerable person, a helper with a platform, an audience with money, no safeguards. That formula always ends the same way. Not with empowerment, with intervention. So before we move into the final part, I want to leave you with one question that matters more than blame. If Timmy had been protected early, not from poverty, not from hardship, but from monetization, would he still be home today? Think about that before answering in the comments, because how you answer that determines what kind of stories we allow to happen next. At the end of all this, there's a silence that doesn't feel like closure. It feels like something unfinished, something unresolved, something that can't be repaired no matter how many arrests, investigations, or comment debates happen next. Because Timmy didn't lose his life. He lost his world. The porch, the routine, the familiar voices, the same dirt under his shoes, the same